to St. John's River State College, our Science Cafe series. I'm Professor Karen Meyer, and tonight, speaking tonight for us is Justina Dacey with the St. John's RIVERKEEPER. I know all of my students have learned about the St. John's RIVERKEEPER and kind of what its mission is in my classes, but hopefully, and in the fall, we had the St. John's RIVERKEEPER here talking about harmful algal blooms and kind of how toxic they are, but tonight, the focus is on what you can actually do about it as a citizen, your part to prevent harmful algal blooms. So I can introduce Justina.
All right, thank you very much. Well, good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming out tonight. I already got it. So this evening, I'm going to obviously talk about harmful algal blooms and how you can prevent them using river-friendly landscaping, but as well as some other ways that you can do that. As Karen mentioned, I am with the St. John's RIVERKEEPER. I'm the Community Engagement Coordinator. So I do a lot of the outreach and education and, of course, getting people engaged and involved with the river. Just to give you a brief background about myself, so I went to Florida State University and got my bachelor's in biology, which then I went on to work for the Department of Environmental Protection as well as the Environmental Protection Agency to do a mix of coral research as well as water quality resource research. And then eventually went to Jacksonville University to get my master's in marine science, where I ended up today working with St. John's RIVERKEEPER. So for those of you who are not too familiar with the St. John's RIVERKEEPER, we are a local nonprofit environmental organization. Our office is located mainly in Jacksonville, but we also recently have an office in Central Florida. Our main mission, though, is really to be an independent voice that defends, advocates, and activates others to protect and restore the St. John's River. We are an affiliate of the Waterkeeper Alliance. This is a much larger nonprofit that really works worldwide to make sure we have clean drinking water around the world. So the way we try to do our work is really to empower our citizens by having them investigate these pollution problems. So if you see an algal bloom out there, we want you to let us know about it. We do a lot of advocacy for policy changes. Lisa Reineman is the RIVERKEEPER. She is sort of the public face for the organization, and she's out there working with local officials as well as our representatives to make better water policy changes. We're constantly trying to find solutions and what we consider sensible solutions to these very complex problems, but as well as getting out there, educating the public like we are tonight with presentations, but as well as having an outreach booth at local festivals and events. And of course, we're wanting to raise awareness about these issues to get our citizens involved and engaged. So just to orient you a little bit to the St. John's River, it is the longest river in Florida. It flows over 310 miles, starting down in the southern Florida area, if you can see here, where it is the St. John's Marsh, slowly flows in a northern direction, goes through many different lakes. Its nickname is actually the River of Lakes, where it ends up here in Jacksonville, where it empties into the Atlantic Ocean. It is divided up into 3 different basins. So the bottom here is going to be your upper basin, which is the headwaters. The middle is considered the middle basin. And then, of course, where we live up here is called the lower basin. It is a unique river, though, because of the tidal influences. So here we have the Atlantic Ocean pushing those tides in and out, causing a very productive estuary. So a lot of the organisms that we like to commercially fish for or eat, maybe blue crab or shrimp, they rely on these estuaries to survive. Another unique feature of the St. John's River are these springs. Raise your hand, how many of you guys have ever been to one of the springs? Okay, so a fair amount of you guys. So these springs, they stay a constant between 68 to 72 degrees warm. And really, they're an important habitat for our manatees during the winter months. Now, manatees, even though they're a very large marine mammal, they actually have a very thin layer of blubber, meaning they can't handle when the ocean temperatures begin to drop they really can't handle those colder water temps. So they begin their migration upstream into the St. Johns River and then hang out in these springs here. These springs also provide habitat, though, for some really unique organisms. We have lots of endemic species, meaning species you're not going to find anywhere else in the world. There's blind crawfish that live in certain caves that are only found in that cave. There's snails. There's also blind catfish. Lots of different species that this habitat provides for. So as you saw, there's lots of beautiful places on the St. Johns River, but unfortunately, due to that slow flow, it has a lot of problems with nutrient pollution. Now, when I say nutrients, I basically mean an excess of nitrogen and phosphorus. So these are the two elements you're going to find typically in your fertilizers. But this begs the question, where are these nutrients really coming from? Well, the answer is they come from us. They come from our neighborhoods, our lawns, our yards. So even in your own home, if you have that nice, lush green St. Augustine grass, it's very thirsty. It needs a lot of fertilizer. So over time, when we have rains, that fertilizer, those nutrients are going to run off of all of these surfaces here, and they're going to end up in our nearest waterway, into our tributaries, as well as into our river and eventually oceans. Another culprit that we have here commonly in Florida, there's over 1,300 golf courses just in Florida, and every year there's about a few more that are designed and built. These golf courses, though, they don't really utilize native grasses, as you can see here. And these grasses, again, to keep them nice and lush and green, you're going to need a lot of fertilizer as well as pesticides to keep them nice. Agricultural lands and cattle lands are the biggest culprit for our nutrient problem. Here in Florida, we are the second producer to the nation for vegetable production. We grow everything from watermelons to bell peppers to tomatoes. We provide about 63% of the citrus in the whole country here. And really, you can kind of grow anything under the sun because it is a sunshine state. For cattle lands, even though they may look like they're nice and they're possibly sort of wild, but they do need to be maintained. And that means you have to fertilize that grass as well as water it. And so again, nutrient runoff is happening in these systems as well. So JEA and utility overflows are a short-term nutrient pollution that we see. Do you guys remember Hurricane Irma? So when Hurricane Irma happened, we had about 1.5 million gallons of raw sewage flow into our St. Johns River. And this was because of those lift stations failing due to those power outages. Now, how many can you guess? A year prior, when we had Hurricane Matthew, how many gallons do you guys think of raw sewage? Any guesses? I heard someone say it. Yeah, so we had 10 million gallons of raw sewage go into our St. Johns River. And after Hurricane Matthew, I had a gentleman call me and say that he typically harvests clams out of the river. And after the hurricane, he ate a few clams and he ended up very, very sick. And I had to sort of explain to him, did you know that 10 million of gallons of raw sewage was just in the river? So you probably don't want to eat those clams. So when we have that excess in nutrients in our system, whether it's a lake or a pond or a river, we have what is called eutrophication. And when you have eutrophication happening, you're gonna have algal blooms. Now the algal blooms that we see in our river, in Doctor's Lake, in our different tributaries and waterways is sometimes called a blue-green algae, but for the purposes of this presentation, I'm gonna call it cyanobacteria. Now, cyanobacteria is actually photosynthetic, so it is an algae, but it is also a bacteria, and they are all aquatic, so you're going to find them in those freshwater habitats. They are the oldest living organism, over 3.5 billion years old, and they are able to fix nitrogen, but as well as the first organisms to produce oxygen. Some of the problems with this cyanobacteria, though, is that they can produce toxins that can be harmful to your pets, can be harmful to you, but as well as wildlife. And so this is why we're concerned about these blooms. but they have been happening more and more worldwide, and some great examples I have for you are on Lake Erie. So this is a satellite photo over in Toledo, Ohio. So they had an algal bloom this massive, you could see it from space, in 2014. Now the problem with this is that they use their lake as their drinking water. So for Lake Erie, they had to actually filter out the toxins so that people could have their drinking water, and this was a huge water crisis for this town. In China, their pollution problems are a lot more immense than the ones we have. Some of their lakes stay in a constant state of algal bloom. China has spent over $116 billion to try to fix the phosphorus levels in their lakes. It supposedly has been working, but obviously they have a long way to go. And lastly, in our own home state, this is a satellite image of Lake Okeechobee down in central South Florida. It is the biggest lake we have here in Florida. About 2 summers ago, they had a bloom the size of 239 square miles, so if you can sort of see that outline there. The problem with this, though, is that Lake Okeechobee, if the water levels get too high, they'll release that water to both sides of the state. One side, on the west side, it'll go down through the Caloosahatchee River, and on the east side, it goes down the St. Lucie River. Well, they released those waters, and unfortunately, this is what happened on the east coast when that algal bloom met up with those coastal waters. And as you can see here, it's sort of a really nasty sort of green slime. And this was a huge economic impact to the South Florida area for tourism, for people who have kayak fishing tours. All kinds of hotels were unable to keep people there because why do people go to South Florida? For their beautiful beaches. But unfortunately, this is what they looked like for a few weeks. So in this photo here, this is actually a typical cyanobacteria bloom on the St. Johns River. We call these harmful algal blooms, or HABs. This, though, when you see this, that bright green sort of striations on the water, that is that cyanobacteria. Whether we know it's toxic or not, we won't know unless we test it. But to get a bloom of this size, you really have to have that perfect storm of different environmental parameters. So really good sunlight, which we have plenty of here in the Sunshine State. Those warmer temperatures, you typically see these blooms in the summer months because of those warmer temperatures. Water residency time. I mentioned that the St. Johns River is very slow flowing. That means that it holds that nutrient-rich water there longer. Of course, climate change is going to cause a higher frequency of these blooms because of our warmer climates. And then lastly, us continually adding nutrients to these systems. So really quick, I just wanted to teach you, though, the difference between a cyanobacteria bloom and then just sort of regular sort of algal blooms that are not toxic to you. So on the top here, we have various floating plants. These are just plants that are not anchored to the substrate. And typically, you're going to see ones like these. This is a water lettuce. It's actually considered an invasive aquatic plant. It's not originally from here, but today it seems to proliferate in our lakes and ponds. Another algal you're going to see is duckweed. So these are kind of tiny little plants. They'll tend to explode in growth across the surface of a pond. A lot of times people will call us and report this, saying that it's an algal bloom, but it's not a true cyanobacterial bloom. And below we have our submerged aquatic vegetation, or SAVs. These are important habitats, of course, for a lot of the commercial species that we like to catch and fish for. And also, they're very unique in the sense that they're one of the only underwater flowering plants. So they actually have flowers that bloom underwater. It's quite unique. And the other two kinds, filamentous algae, this one is often reported by people thinking it's a cyanobacteria bloom, but it is not. Filamentous algae is just kind of this very stringy algae. You'll see it sort of creating these floating mats and kind of billowing clouds of algae. Usually they're in sort of stagnant water or slow-moving water, but again, if you're seeing this, it's most likely not toxic, but I wouldn't get in the water where you see it. And lastly, on the bottom, we have emergent plants. These are just basically the plants that you're going to find along the shoreline that are emerging out of the water. And sometimes if you see a bloom, you want to look in between these grasses because you'll see a lot more of that cyanobacteria sort of accumulate there. So these toxic blooms, they can have catastrophic impacts to wildlife. When the bloom happens, of course, it's depleting the oxygen in the water, which then suffocates fish. And so you're going to possibly see some form of a fish kill, and this could be fish floating on the surface or, of course, washing up along the shoreline. Another problem is that when these blooms happen, it sort of covers the whole surface green, and it blocks out that sunlight, which then, of course, causes those submerged aquatic vegetation that I talked about to die off, and this can be a big problem too. As you saw, some of those fish that die off, sometimes pelicans, dolphins, other larger predators will eat those fish and they'll end up getting the toxic effects. But also manatees, even though they're herbivores, they will possibly have effects from these toxic blooms. Down in the Indian River Lagoon, they've had over 150 manatees die off in the last few years because of these blooms. But actually what's happening is the seagrass beds died off because of past blooms. Like I said, it blocked that light. And then they switched their diet over. So they typically use seagrass to munch on, but now they moved over to a different species called Gracilaria. Now this Gracilaria was full of those toxins over time, and so all of these manatees, they kind of did necropsies on them and found out their guts were full of this Gracilaria sludge, and they think that's what was causing the toxins to them. So some other impacts, humans and pets, right, and kids, we have to think about those things. These blooms, if you are near one and it is toxic, can cause upper respiratory problems. If you touch it, you may get a rash. There are different implications that can happen. But every species of algae produces different toxins. These different toxins react to us differently. Microcystin is the more common toxin that we find. This is considered a hepatotoxin, meaning it causes damage to the liver as well as to the kidney. It has what is called a fast death factor. Cylindrospermopsin, the second one here, is another hepatotoxin. Again, causes that damage to your liver and to your kidney, and that's if it's ingested. It also has the potential to alter DNA and RNA, so there's lots of research out there going on about these different toxins. Anatoxin, the third one here, is a neurotoxin. They say that the toxin is the equivalent to cobra venom. So it is a very highly toxic venom that you don't, or toxin that you don't want to have to deal with. Lastly, you may have heard of this one. Saxitoxin is another neurotoxin, and this is related to paralytic shellfish poisoning. So what happens is you have an oyster, you have some sort of shellfish that is, of course, in an area where a harmful algal bloom happened. They're filtering up that water, and of course, they're accumulating those toxins. And so if you are exposed to saxitoxin, they say it has a very fast death factor. What will happen is initially your tongue and your lips will start to sort of tingle. Eventually it'll move to your fingers and toes, and then over time you'll lose all control of your muscles. So eventually you'll have respiratory failure. So it is a very dangerous toxin that you don't want to be exposed to. So now that I've made you terrified of the waters here, I'm just going to go over some of the things that you can do. I thought this was a great little brochure, sort of know it, avoid it, report it, and I'll sort of cover all of these different things in the next few slides. So to report a bloom, this here is actually a real photo of Doctor's Lake taken about, I want to say 2 summers ago. Obviously these people did not know about toxic algal blooms because they were taking their kids on a tube right through it. But if you want to report a bloom and you see a bloom and you're pretty sure it could be toxic, what you want to do is report it to the Florida Department of Environmental Protection. Today they have a really great form where you can go online, fill out where you saw it, when you saw it, and what's really nice is they'll also go out and take a sample and figure out, is it toxic or not? So this here is the number you can call, but this here is also where you can find that form to fill out. So it's reportalgalbloom.com. But what's really great is that once they go out there and they take that sample, they've become a lot more transparent. And they provide these maps. So this is actually Doctor's Lake, if you guys can see. And these are all different samples that were taken over this summer of different blooms or different water quality reports. They have it over the course of different days. And also each dot, when you click on it, it'll show the toxicity level of what they tested for. So this is a really great tool that the government agency has been utilizing for this area and for the general public. Another thing you can do is report a polluter. So working for St. John's Riverkeeper, we pull the weirdest stuff out of waterways sometimes. Everything from lots of tires to antifreeze to you name it, we've probably found it. And so if you see someone possibly dumping in Doctor's Lake or dumping into the river, you can report this. We do have this app called Water Rangers. It is a map-based app, and you can download it actually for free on your iPhone or Android, or you can just go on their website and sign up. I typically use it on the computer. It seems to work much better than the app. But really quickly, I'm just going to show you how to use this app. So what you want to do is go on there and create your profile here. And so this will show sort of the different reports that you've done. Over time, you can win, award different badges, but I don't typically follow that. And then you want to make sure you join the St. John's Riverkeeper team. So if you join the team, then when you make a report, it'll come to us and we will see it. Then you want to go out and maybe scout. So drive around Doctor's Lake, drive around different areas. Maybe you were boating that day and you just happened to see a bloom. You can come home and report it or just use the app. If you do find an issue, there are different categories that it's divided up into. Of course, issues with wildlife could be anything from hurt birds to manatees. Shoreline alterations, we consider this sort of construction site violations. If you see a lot of dirt going into a waterway, that is a construction site violation. Any sort of pollution and dumping, water quality issues can be anything very broad. And then of course algal blooms and any other things that you think might be out of those categories. Once you begin your report, you're going to create a location and then you're going to make your report. So this here is kind of what it's going to look like. This is an example of someone reporting pollution. There was dumping. It looks like they dumped grocery carts into a creek. And then what's nice is it'll create a dialogue and you can see what's going on. So you can go on Water Rangers now and you can look and see if other people have already done reports near you or near your neighborhood. This here is just an example I wanted to show you of how we've reported an algal bloom in the past. This was one down in the Ponte Vedra area, actually I think in a pond. And so of course we were investigating it. It was reported. Here are the photos of it. And then the issue was closed once we figured out what the problem was. So when you see an algal bloom, you don't really know if it's toxic or not. We can't tell that. But some things you can do is sort of, does it smell bad? Is there a weird odor going on? Is the water discolored? That's probably a big sign that this is a bloom. But also you want to make sure you're going to avoid that water body. You don't want to be these people who are actually about to get in the water there. That's not a good example. But also look for evidence that it could be toxic. There could be fish floating up at the surface nearby, so maybe there was a fish kill, kind of giving you an idea it's toxic. But make sure to follow the health advisories from the Florida Department of Health and also the Florida Department of Environmental Protection. They will put out those announcements and let you know if a water body is safe or not. Something that you can do at home is what we call creating a river-friendly yard. This here is actually what we call a bioswale or a rain garden, so it does a really nice job of allowing that rain to sort of settle in the middle there and get filtered out. The plants, of course, filter out a lot of the pollution. And these are all native plants, everything from cypress trees to muley grass. This is a form of what we call river friendly. We don't expect you to change your yard that drastically, but some real easy things that you can do are use a low phosphorus, slow release fertilizer, and I do have a few examples of that on the front table here. Once you're done, we can talk more about it if you're interested. You can find this fertilizer at Home Depot. It's in the pellet form. It's not a mysterious thing to find. Of course, you can always fertilize less, maybe only do it twice a year. Find out the best time of year to do it because there are different times that are better. In this scenario, less is always best. Avoid fertilizers containing weed killers or pesticides. So this is weed and feed. There's some pretty nasty chemicals in there. So if you can avoid that, maybe pull the weeds out by hand, just use mechanical methods so you don't have to use chemicals at all. And lastly, water efficiently, which I'll talk a little bit more about in the next slide. So for efficient irrigation, and I know that this doesn't count for some of you students who maybe live in apartments, but things you can do is get involved and find out how does your landlord do these things and ask these questions. But know your days, know when you can use your sprinkler system. Sometimes it's odd numbers are Monday, Wednesday, Friday. Evens are Tuesday, Thursday. It just sort of depends on where you live. But also you can use micro irrigation. This is great for those garden beds, shrubbery, and ground cover. Make sure in your neighborhood you're maintaining and inspecting your sprinkler systems. If it's a broken sprinkler head, try to replace it as soon as possible. If it's flooding into your driveway or into your sidewalk, of course, make sure you get that fixed. If you see your neighbors maybe having problems, you can report that as well, or tell them really that there is a problem. And lastly, you want to pay attention to the rain. If it's raining every day, you probably don't have to water your lawn. So some other things we can do are plant natives. So I like to call native planting the lazy man's garden because once you plant native plants, they are well adapted to Florida. So you're not going to have to really worry too much about watering them. You really don't have to worry much about fertilizing them. And maintenance is pretty low. So here we have Coreopsis is a really nice wildflower. Once it's maintained, it's very easy to take care of, or once it's established. Up here, this grass is called muley grass. They call it the superstar plant because it's very hardy and it can handle drought tolerance, but as well as the flooding. And also during the fall, it produces these really nice sort of fluffy pink stalks that a lot of landscapers like. In the middle is a blanket flower. Again, another wildflower that's pretty easy to maintain, can handle a diversity of soils. And on the bottom here is beauty berry. You may have seen this if you've gone hiking. This is a native berry. If you want to attract wildlife into your backyard, this is a great plant to have. The Native Americans actually used the roots and the tea leaves to treat malaria and fevers, and there was a lot of other medicinal uses for this berry. Only rain down the drain. So if you're in your neighborhood walking your dog and you happen to notice that the storm drain is just completely clogged by leaves, but maybe trash, clean it up. Do your part sort of to help your community. After Hurricane Irma, we told a lot of people to do this because neighborhoods were still flooded because their storm drains were so clogged with debris and trash. A lot of people don't know this, but actually blowing your leaves into the storm drain is illegal. That is considered a form of a nutrient pollution. So if you see people doing that, that's actually illegal and you can report them on that. So conserving water, I talked a little bit more about irrigation in the yard and how to conserve water, but in your own home, there's really easy things that you can do, everything from trying to take shorter showers. So we do a lot of education with kids, and we try to tell them to take a shower as long as the time of a song is. So most songs on average are about 3 minutes. Which kids tend to think that 3 minutes is insanely short for a shower. But so that's something you can do at home. Brushing your teeth, turning off the faucet, maybe when you wash your dishes, being a little more aware of how much water you're using. So there's lots of things that you can do inside the home to conserve that water. So I've talked a lot about some of the different river-friendly things that you can do to help, of course, reduce water and nutrient pollution from getting into our waterways. But we do have a ton of resources out there. So if you go onto our website, we have a whole section on river-friendly, everything from more details on the fertilizing to water conservation, landscaping, pesticides, and that energy conservation. If you have some spare time, Bringing Nature Home is a book by Doug Tallamy. This basically talks about how if you plant native plants, you're going to increase that diversity of insects, which is going to increase your diversity of birds, and so on and so on. And what's interesting is he is a photographer who just sat in his backyard and photographed birds feeding their babies. And he noticed that with the native plants, there was much better success rate for those birds, a higher diversity versus the non-natives. It's really interesting, some of the essentially research he did. The St. Johns River Water Management District has a lot of great resources on water conservation, but as well as plants. The University of Florida has a whole program called Florida Yards and Neighborhoods. I actually brought some brochures today from them on their Florida-friendly landscaping. So they have sort of a 9 principles to Florida-friendly landscaping. And then lastly, the Florida Native Plant Society, they have a really great website where you can go on and put your zip code, you can put in what kind of yard you have, if it's full sun or half sun, what kind of animals and things you want to attract, whether it's butterflies, and then it'll sort of spit out a really nice list for you of here's all the plants that you can plant in your yard. So it's a great resource to utilize. So for those of you that are homeowners, I'm not sure how many are in this audience right now, if you have septic tanks, these are a huge problem here in Florida because of the type of geologic rock that we have here. But maintaining your septic tanks is really important, 1, to save you money in the long run, and 2, to really help protect our environment from, of course, having these extra nutrients leach into our waterways. So another thing you can easily do is educate yourself as well as others. So tonight you're out here learning more about these issues and learning ways that you can help and get involved. But maybe you can go home and tell your parents or tell your siblings or tell your roommates and let them know that, you know, these are things that are happening and here's the small behavioral changes you can do. Get involved. So St. Johns Riverkeeper, we host cleanups once a month. We have Rising Tides is our young professionals group, and they clean up the McCoy's Creek, which is down in the Jacksonville Riverside area. And this here is just one of their cleanups that they do and how much trash they pull out. It's quite amazing how much they really do. But if you want to get involved more, I will say this weekend is the annual St. Johns River Cleanup and Celebration. It is hosted by the city of Jacksonville, but I know Clay County also, I believe, does it on the same date, where you can go out and join in 50 different sites along the river and clean up during, I believe, 10 to noon. And you can ask me more for information about that after. So I just wanted to say thank you to, of course, St. Johns River State College and Karen Meyer for setting up this science cafe. I know it probably wasn't as science-y as maybe some of you hoped, but I'd also like to thank Carol Bailey White for a lot of the beautiful photos that I have. And at this point, if you guys have any questions, feel free to ask. I will say at the front table there, I have lots of informational brochures, everything from how to reduce algal blooms to Florida-friendly landscaping. And I also, if you're interested, I forgot to pass it out, have an algal bloom sample. Don't worry, it's not toxic, but this is basically just so you have an idea of really what a cyanobacterial bloom looks like. So, all right, well, thank you guys very much.